12 months, 2 trillion lines of code, and 700,000 scans. I'm Tonya Hall for ZDNet and Tech Republic, and joining me is Mark Curphey. He is the Vice President of Strategy at CA Veracode. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
Talk about your role at CA Veracode. What do you do exactly?
Sure. So most recently, I was the CEO of a company called SourceClear, which was acquired by Veracode about 6 months ago. SourceClear focused on helping software developers use open source code safely. Previous to that, a lot of people may know my name as the guy who created OWASP, the Open Web Application Security, and I've ran software security at financial services places like Charles Schwab and ran security tools teams at places like Microsoft.
CA Veracode just released a new report, State of Software Security Volume 9. What are your goals for these series of reports?
Yeah, so the series of reports have really become a sort of a pulse check on where we are with software security over the years. I think it's the 9th report that we've done. This year, one of the key things, of course, is DevOps is really taking hold. And, we were able to examine some of the trends and sort of highlight to some of the people how some of the positive things around DevOps is affecting software security.
Over the course of 12 months, you scanned over 2 trillion lines of code across 700,000 scans. What methodology and technology is involved in that kind of feat?
Yeah, so we have a large array of customers from sort of the hyper modern total DevOps shops that are really doing continuous delivery through to more traditional shops. Most of those traditional development shops, can be a couple of thousand developers. They're really embracing DevOps. So everything across the spectrum. We see all of those, traditional languages. So a lot of Java applications through to, modern JavaScript applications built on Node. So it's the complete spectrum of those things. What you will see though is pretty consistent trends. So one of the big trends that we saw, particularly for this year, is that the more people scan, the more likely they are to fix issues. So that was the really interesting thing. And of course, that's following the wave of DevOps. We're consistently building applications, consistently releasing them. And the great news is the more you do that, the more likely you are to fix the flaws before they go out into production.
The report states that more than 85% of all applications contain at least one vulnerability, and 13 have at least one critical flaw. Where do the vulnerabilities usually lie?
Well, what we've seen is we've seen development fundamentally change. If you kind of go back 10 years ago, we basically built everything from the ground up. These days, we typically take a framework, we take a set of open source components, and then we go and implement those things on top of that. The reality is that you are still essentially writing a book. When you write code, it's a blank sheet of paper. And with that, you have an opportunity to write, an absolute classic or an absolute howler. And so the developers still have a vast amount of freedom. And with that, you have the opportunity to sort of introduce, insecure coding practices or use things in an insecure way. What we see as a general trend is the more people start to use frameworks and they start to essentially sort of implement things that have already been defined as being secure, less chance that they're going to make those common mistakes, but still lots of those things that are being made.
What software contains the most vulnerable components, and are there less vulnerable replacements for them?
Gosh, we could start a Twitter war around what's the most insecure language, right? Or is open source less secure than closed source code? The reality is that everyone is faced with the same fundamental challenges, and it's my kind of analogy is again it's like writing a book. It's grammar checking, it's spell checking, but even if you got all of those things perfect, you could still write a book which isn't readable or whatever. What we have to think about is, independent of the language, there are a set of common practices that everyone should be doing. We have to think about authentication, authorization, how we use cryptography. And all of those things can be done well, or they can be done badly. And what we have to do is help the developers do those things well and implement those things as intended so that we don't wind up with these security flaws and vulnerabilities.
SQL injection and cross-site scripting vulnerabilities have been around for years. So why are we still suffering these?
Yeah, well, they have, haven't they? I remember when cross-site scripting first appeared, kind of giving my age here, right? And I remember, back in the early 2000s, I used to actually run a security services team, and I think we pulled out like 300,000 credit cards through SQL injection. And yeah, here we are almost, 15 years later with the same issues. The good news about most of those things, again, when it comes to people implementing frameworks, is many of the frameworks take care of classes of problems. So if you are using a modern framework today, it's pretty hard to have a SQL injection problem. You don't write code which directly manipulates SQL. You use an object relational mapper, which sits in front of that and generally takes care of most of those issues. The same with cross-site scripting. If you're using frameworks, React and Angular and things, they have protections built in for those things. But the reality in the real world is that most people are still dealing with a lot of legacy code. The more code that you build up, it's very hard to retire it. It's super easy on a textbook to go, hey, we're going to throw that away and use the latest and greatest. It just doesn't work like that in the real world. And so a lot of these flaws are people continuing to take legacy code, maintain it, and not use those latest and greatest technologies. So we're going to be plagued with those things for a long, long time. And we have to have strategies of how to deal with that. It can't be just like, let me upgrade to the latest thing and all these problems are going to go away. How do we deal with these problems that are in legacy code bases, which are very large?
When you look ahead at 2019, what DevOps security trends do you see?
Well, I'm here in the middle of San Francisco. Kind of a lot of people think of, Silicon Valley and, Uber and Twitter and all these guys down the road that are really leading the charge on, continuous delivery. So this is the notion of, how we basically, find a small discrete amount of work, small batch software, the developer can push it right the way through to production, and this thing is happening constantly. That is an extremely exciting prospect for the security industry because it allows us to take issues and push them right through to production, fix things fast, close the window of opportunity for hackers to go and exploit. The other thing that is exciting about DevOps is that, we've moved into this world where we now have distributed networks. And so, everyone's kind of working remotely, et cetera. In the old days, you probably remember we used to have firewalls and we used to have these kind of, control gates that you had to go through. That often changed when the cloud came along, right? So from the old traditional ways of doing application security were you had to go to someone to deploy to a data center. All of a sudden with the cloud, that went away. But what we're now seeing with continuous delivery and continuous integration is essentially a source of truth. You run through the CI system. The CI system makes a determination, is this the correct quality that I can go deploy to? So that allows us to have that same place that we can define, is this the correct security quality that we're allowed to go to deploy? So, it's an exciting time to be able to rally around a central control point, but also a control point that is driven around automation. So, automation at scale. How can we make sure that this happens in a distributed way for every developer committing code into this and pass it through?
Mark Curphey, VP of Strategy at CA Veracode. If somebody wants to connect with you, how might they do that?
Probably the easiest way is on Twitter, at Curphey, Curphey.
Thanks again for joining me. And if you guys want to find my interviews, I'm here on ZDNet, Tech Republic, or TonyaHall.net. Thanks for watching.